Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is John R. Knott, the author of Imagining Wild America. Welcome to Rip Rap, John.
Thanks.
We've had a number of scholars on this program, but I don't think any of them felt that an 18-day canoe trip in the backcountry of northern Alaska was the singular formative experience that led them to write a scholarly book, much less construct a class or a series of classes on any particular research topic. Perhaps you could explain how your interest in wild America began and the connection to Alaska in your quest.
Sure. I wouldn't say it's the singular shaping influence. It certainly did affect my sense of this and my interest in it. And I would say the other thing was taking a lot of canoe trips with my wife at the time and over a period of years, and going up to a particular area in Canada that I talk about, Temagami, and reading a lot of the things that I ended up teaching when I was in places like this, and suddenly deciding, you have to realize that I was a scholar of Renaissance literature, still am, I guess, and teaching it, writing books about it, deciding that people weren't teaching some of these things, or at least in my university, and maybe I would try it. And so I started a course called Literature of the American Wilderness, which I've been teaching for over a dozen years now. And I think it was really teaching that course and getting deeper into this material that made me want to write about it. And I teach other kinds of things that are related to it too, and really have sort of branched off into what people would now call literature in the environment, or maybe eco-criticism. So, but I didn't anticipate any of that when I just started teaching this course.
You were studying the Puritans, if I remember correctly.
Right, I was finishing a book on Protestant martyrdom, and deep in John Fox's Book of Martyrs and all that bloody stuff, and which I still find very interesting. But I think and I'd written another book on the Puritans, and I think I was a bit burned out on that and looking for something else, and maybe looking for a different kind of audience as well.
And quite ready for a walk in the forest or anything like that.
Sure, and I think it's one of these circumstances of your avocation becoming your vocation, or the recreational merging with the professional, and I mean, there are a whole variety of factors. It's hard to sort out. But I think taking these trips was part of it. And I as I tell students in this course, I'm not a hardcore wilderness type. There are lots of people who are out there doing more rugged things than I have. But getting out like that did make a difference. And I think getting out and reading people like Thoreau or Muir or Waldo Leopold, other people I teach, in that context did have an effect. And teaching it year after year, and teaching to students who were refreshingly different from the usual English majors. They come in from all over the university. I think the word wilderness sparks something, and so I get people who've been canoeing for years, or climbing mountains, or just have come from a little town in the UP of Michigan where they've grown up like in the woods.
Well, I thought it was an interesting example of how someone, like you're saying, takes something that had been sort of an avocation interest, but then brings a scholarly perspective to it, and then that kind of enhances and enlarges the whole dimension of what people are thinking about that topic.
Well, I hope so, and it's fun for me, and I think given my sort of scholarly bent, when I get into something like this, for example, writing about Audubon, I want to see the originals of Audubon's manuscripts for the ornithological biography, which is what I write about. This was a series of volumes he wrote in connection with the Birds of America. So I went around to a few rare book libraries and dug up the manuscripts that exist, and discovered, in fact, that he was very heavily edited, and it was very interesting to see what his Scottish editor had done to it. And how he
sometimes helping, sometimes not.
Well, making him sort of write for genteel 19th century audiences, but losing some of the spontaneity and roughness in the process.
That was fascinating with the Audubon. You know, he had all these volumes of work that he had done.
Well, people don't realize, I think, or a lot of people, a few people like me are beginning to realize it and write a little about it, but they don't realize that he wrote all of this to go with the Birds of America to help sell it. He was quite a promoter out there trying to sell this book, and it by subscription, and it was very expensive to buy the whole thing, and that's how he supported his family. So he would do most anything, including dressing up like Daniel Boone and giving wolf howls in London society to come off as the American woodsman. He's a fascinating character, but the prose is interesting, and just the fact that he was out there at that time in the early 19th century, trekking around on his own into places other people weren't going.
And sending kind of like reports back to civilization about what he was seeing.
He was, and you can't trust him entirely. He's very theatrical. I think the theatricality you see in his bird etchings, the originally drawings and paintings, extends to his life, and he was great at inventing experiences that he didn't have, and inventing ancestry that he didn't have. So you had to be very careful about it.
I thought that some of the distinctions throughout the book about wildness, wilderness were pretty interesting, and they're kind of a trope almost that you discussed throughout.
That's really an instance of broadening my own sense of what wilderness was. I started teaching this course with a fairly simple notion of wilderness. I identified in sort of in its purest form with this Alaska experience, which was on the Noatak River in very uninhabited country and with little trace of human presence, and came to realize how complicated our use of the term was, our understanding of the term was, and I think in recent years have come to be more interested in the notion of wildness, which is really more flexible than wilderness. And also in the course of this time, quite a sort of academic discussion has grown up about wilderness, and there have been attacks on the notion of wilderness and a great emphasis on the extent to which it's a culturally constructed term. It's part of the whole sort of emphasis on social construction in academic discourse, and a lot of that is good. At the same time, I found myself reacting against it and saying the effect of this is to devalue the term wilderness completely, and that has all kinds of political implications and other implications, and ignores the fact that there is this powerful drive toward experiencing something like that in people. But I did come to believe that we needed to talk about wildness more, and that wilderness wasn't enough.
And it was interesting how each author that you look at has a slightly different take on it, a different place that they come from as they look at those terms and look at what might be considered nature or wild nature or wilderness or wildness.
Sure. I think it evolves, and I think actually the term, originally wilderness was a negative term. The first settlers thought of it as the howling wilderness and the dark forest and a desolate place and full of savages, and it's only gradually in the 19th century that it becomes a term with value and really as part of the Romantic movement. And some of the criticism has been that this is just a reflection of the Romantic sublime, or it's a constructed notion that we've come to. It has nothing to do with Native American culture. They really, by and large, have no sense of wilderness in certain parts of the world. Non-Western parts, it doesn't have the value it does for us. So it's a very culturally charged term. But Thoreau is interesting for me and important for me because he was, I think, the first person really to open up the sense of the term. And he uses the term wildness a lot. When he says in wildness is the preservation of the world, he really doesn't say wilderness, though he's often misquoted by people who say wilderness. And he talks a lot about wildness. And when Muir picks it up, Muir after Thoreau, very influenced by Thoreau, wildness becomes something else. And I like to sort of teach Thoreau against Muir, or Muir against Thoreau, and look at their differences. And students like that. I find they are so attracted to Muir, despite the fact that he's a much more enthusiastic, rhapsodic writer and not as good a prose writer as Thoreau. They're very taken by his personality and enthusiasm and the sort of headlong quality of him and his recklessness. He's out climbing huge trees and mountains and doing crazy things, and so I have to sort of be careful not to rehabilitate Thoreau, to get them to take Thoreau seriously enough.
Well, I thought it was interesting. I had a feeling of like you enlarged my sense of Thoreau, what he was about. And also with Audubon, you feel like you know what their works are, but actually there's much more that when you play, have close analysis of them, there's a much larger dimension to their work.
Well, they're both complicated, and certainly Thoreau is a very complicated and a very good writer, and he's the one figure that I write about in this book who has received a lot of attention. So it's harder to say anything new about Thoreau, even Thoreau in Wildness, though I try, and I think he's an absolutely critical person in this book because he's had such an enormous influence. So that everyone it's like Southern writers trying to deal with the presence of Faulkner. I think people who are writing about nature or wildness or whatever are always aware of Thoreau. And one of the surprises, in a way, of working on these people was how much Thoreau was embedded in the consciousness of them. I actually went and looked at Muir's papers in California. They're at the University of the Pacific in Stockton. And his copies of Thoreau's works are out there. There's another set that he had that's in the Huntington Library in Pasadena. But I looked at his annotations of Thoreau, his other reactions to Thoreau. You find him arguing with Thoreau at times, correcting Thoreau, drawing great bold lines under Thoreau talking about one thing or another. And obviously he was just deeply, deeply influenced. And you look at someone like Abbey, and he is arguing with Thoreau. He has a long essay called Down the River with Henry Thoreau, where he's reading Walden as he goes down, maybe it's the Green River, and arguing with Thoreau. And at the same time, obviously deeply influenced by him. I think in Abbey's case, it's the sort of individualistic, anarchic streak in Thoreau that he most responds to. Wendell Berry responds to another side of Thoreau.
And Mary Oliver.
And Mary Oliver, and that's...
and walking,
Oh, sure. That was a kind of surprise, and she is sort of the unusual person in this book, the surprising one, and I like the idea of writing about her because I like her poetry very much, and getting into it, I did recognize that there was more affinity with Thoreau and more actual echoing of Thoreau than I expected to find, and I realized that actually she is doing the same kind of thing. She's going back repeatedly to the same places where she lives, walking all the time. As she says at one point, she's getting deeper and deeper into the ordinary. And I think that's what Thoreau did, in a way. If you just keep going back to this swamp or these woods or whatever and finding more in them, you're doing that. And so I think she's in many ways, consciously or unconsciously, modeling a lot of what she does on Thoreau, though of course she's very different, and we're 150 years apart.
Well, I thought it was interesting you make the comments that whereas with Thoreau it was a crusade when he went on a walk. He went west and then came home east. With her it was a rambling.
Yes, it is a rambling, and Thoreau's very witty about the way he talks about walking, as he often is, and provocative, and yet there is very much that sense of pilgrimage, crusade, playing on those things, more dramatic sort of ending in his essay, Walking, which is a wonderful essay and really his best piece on wildness and wilderness, but a sort of grand visionary ending, whereas Mary Oliver talks much more about just getting up in the morning and walking out into the green world, as she would put it, and yet you can see she's doing much the same thing, and she's also finding a kind of transcendence in her way, visionary. She uses the word floating a lot, and there is this sense of sort of floating into some kind of detached experience or ecstatic experience with her that registers with Thoreau somewhat. Different kind of concern with transcendence in Thoreau.
Well, and going a little bit back to that wildness, wilderness, there's also the element that it can also be right where you are in supposedly
Yes,
civilized areas
yes.
and within yourself. And I thought that added somewhat of an edge to the whole
I
thing.
think that's important, and it's important to get people to see that and recognize it yourself. Some of the critique of wilderness has been, the academic critique of wilderness, has been really based on the sense that there are dangers in separating the wild and the familiar, or nature and culture, and saying these are simply opposites. And I think it's a valid point to say, if you think wilderness has to be this very removed, has to be Alaska, or the part of Alaska I was talking about, or the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, say, then you don't notice that there is a natural world around you, you're living with it, there's actually wildness where you are. I don't know about your house. In my house, there are wild creatures. There are mice, there are crickets, there are other things that come in. We had flying squirrels come down our chimney one time. I think it's all around us, and of course we have our wild places in the city, and I think we need to recognize that it's not something just out there. That the wild and the domestic are very intertwined. We're a little wild ourselves. We do have our instinctual responses, which really sort of remind us of that we're animals too. And I think that's one of the more interesting things about it, and we need to learn to think in that way. And at the same time, and to think about, Mary Oliver talks about the wilderness of the body. There is the senses are wild, and she will talk about eating blackberries in such a way that she begins to seem like a bear, and she's very conscious of that comparison. Gary Snyder is very good on the sense in which wildness is everywhere, and wildness is around us. And I think people can generally accept that. Even the people who critique the notion of wilderness, or the attachment to the idea of wilderness. What I try to do is also sort of get back to the notion of wildness as something separate from us too, not just the vines in your front yard, or whatever the weeds that come up through the sidewalk in the city. But there is, and the writers I'm dealing with really are working out of a tradition of celebrating a wildness that is often found in what we might call wilderness. And they do think about it as something other, something separate. Abby talks about a world beyond. And to some extent, I'm trying to legitimize that at a time when it has come under some criticism.
And a wildness like when Thoreau was at sea, that is so, I don't know, awe-inspiring, but so total, so big that, it's almost hard to comprehend. Or Muir on top of a mountain, or any of those experiences are just so big.
Well, and then writing about them can get to be a problem. How do you do that? And I guess one of the things I find is most challenging and most interesting is to try to find a way to talk about someone like Muir, who is really rhapsodic and enthusiastic. And I think one of the things, and there's no getting around that, it is just a rhapsodic kind of prose. And it sometimes seems redundant. One of the things that was interesting about working on Muir was looking at some of his early drafts of a book I use and talk about more, My First Summer in the Sierra, which started out as journals, and to realize that went from very sketchy field notes to sort of very elaborately rewritten journals in the 1880s, to a thoroughly edited book when he was much older, in the early 1900s, and you can see him revising. You can see him, paring down some of the more abstract, the more gushing language, and making it work better. He still gushes a lot, but learning to write about that, and to find that when you are used to writing about some literature that's much more characterized by contradiction and complication, it is a challenge.
One of the things I was going to comment on is that it would seem easier for these writers to slip into simple binary thinking, people, settlement versus nature. But actually, because they're going into nature, it really is a way that there's kind of a oneness, or there's a kind of a celebration of an integration into nature that I thought about as I was reflecting on the book. I mean, there is a separateness to the wildness, but there's this whole thing about what is settlement, and they don't seem to have much of a problem with that, coming into nature.
Different ones handle it differently, I think. For Muir, I think all of them are looking for a kind of intimacy with nature, and sometimes,
nice
and in Muir's case, with almost a kind of bonding or merging with it, or they're looking for some kind of visionary moment or illumination, as I think Oliver is often. Muir will tend to have a sense of opposition between the wild and the rest of the world down there. You talk about the dusty world down below when he's up in the high Sierras. And I think he has to read out of nature things that would alter his vision. He's remarkable in never showing you any bones and feathers or sick animals. It's
death and violence. Yeah.
He doesn't like that.
That's what I'm saying.
He wants. He has another kind of ideal. Whereas Mary Oliver is fascinated with predators and what she calls the cruel mystery of the world. The fact that the snapping turtle will get the baby duck in the pond, and that's part of it for her, and it's part of the energy and part of the mystery. So they will have different ways of looking at that. She also will oppose the wild to the domestic in a way. She has a wonderful poem about honey, where she gets into a fantasy of leaving the table and going out into the woods and crawling up in a tree and clawing at it. And you sort of are transformed into a bear. But you start out at the table. It's called, I think, At the Table, and or Honey at the Table. And I sort of imagine her starting with one of those little plastic bear jars of honey, and then getting you back to the point where you're really sort of eating the bees and the bark and all of that with the honey. So she's very aware of the domestic as something you get out of and leave as you go into the wild.
As you point out in the book, this book is within the context of what we now call eco-criticism, and its interest in literature and environment, but it seems almost like you've helped create some of that eco-criticism.
Well, I think that there's a lot of it out there, and it's more and more, and it's good, and I think that when you think of sort of where this fits into that, I'm at odds with some of the currents now. I think a lot of that is going toward breaking down the sense of a dichotomy between nature and culture, for example, considering what urban nature is. And I think that's very useful. How do we live with nature in the city? Bringing in more ethnic variety of writing. A lot of the sort of classic wilderness literature, if you look at the people I'm writing about, is in a certain sort of masculine tradition of adventuring, of Thoreau, Muir, Abbey, for example. And people are getting into other kinds of writers. I'm trying to say, really, there is this strong tradition of writing about wildness and wilderness. There's more to be said about it. Don't lose track of it. That's where a lot of the real power is. And that's what people are attracted to, or a lot of people are attracted to. And all these writers I write about are popular. They have large popular reputations. Abbey's Desert Solitaire has sold well over 1 million copies. Mary Oliver is a very popular poet, more popular poet than an academic poet. And the other, Muir, is a sort of icon. So it's very interesting to me that they've tapped into and helped to define a very strong tradition in the American imagination and American writing.
Well, and I've found it interesting that you selected writers that have sort of different topics or areas, like Abbey with desert and Muir with mountain. And
it's partly a matter of personal preference. These are people I read and teach, and partly also a matter of trying to balance it, trying to give a sense of different ways of thinking about wilderness and wildness. So that very consciously I had that in mind with Mary Oliver, though she is someone I teach and enjoy writing about and like. But I think Abbey, some of these people Thoreau has to be there. I wanted someone early, so Audubon was, there could have been other choices, but it was Audubon. Muir is not that much written on, really, and he's such a central figure in the popular imagination of wilderness. And actually an interesting writer when you start looking at him, that I chose him. Wendell Berry, we haven't talked about, is a very important writer in this tradition, and a very popular writer with a very wide influence. Not so much in the academy as out there among people interested in sustainable agriculture and various kinds of things he's interested in, though I'm writing about a particular side of Berry, which is the Berry that's attracted to wild nature. But he's a good example of someone who isn't trapped into a dichotomy of wilderness and culture, and who will insist that they're interwoven, and that you find the wild in the city or in the margins. It's a nice way he talks about things like hedgerows as freeholds of wilderness, he says, where you can have the sort of play of animals and plants and human children. And preserve a kind of wildness that's important even within, say, a farm.
Well, I found it really fascinating that all of these people are very reflective and aware as they're going through their environment about, important things like time, past, present, future, about place, about boundaries, about history.
Mary Oliver says, pay attention. That's the important thing. And I think awareness is one of the attributes of all these writers. I am interested in the notion of time, and partly because I find that some of the critique of wilderness now has been by, some of the best critique has been by environmental historians like William Cronin and Richard White. Cronin in particular has been influential, who will criticize the attraction to wilderness in a simple form as an escape from history. It is, if you think, say, Yosemite is wilderness personified, and don't realize that Yosemite is there as a national park because the Awami's were run out of it by the troops in the 19th century. That Yosemite Valley is the shape it is because of the way they lived with it and affected the environment. So that there is a history of a place like Yosemite. On the other hand, I think the historians can get a little caught up in the history of the last few hundred years of settlement and have a cultural focus that omits some of what these writers are finding in wilderness. The problem I have with Cronin is that he makes it hard to find value in nature in the way that, say, Thoreau and Abbey and Berry would. And so I like to say there are other ways of thinking about time.
Well, it's a very interesting book, and thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Thank you.